Speaker. I rise to speak on this important Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill 2021 as one of the many co-sponsors of the bill and a long-time supporter and advocate for voluntary assisted dying. I also offer my support and confirm the Greens' support as a party to this reform. I am very pleased to be part of a party that has a clear policy position to support the right for people to die with dignity. This is indeed a very personal choice, as we have heard from many in the chamber and as we will continue to hear. These are very personal reasons and very personal choices. And that personal choice, that feeling of looking to your own conscience as to whether or not you wish to choose to die, needs to sit with the person who is terminally ill. I appreciate that in this place people exercise a conscience vote, but for me I always feel very uncomfortable about that idea, because on one hand we recognise the inherently personal nature of the decision, but on the other hand people come into this place and believe that their conscience should determine whether or not a person is able to make that choice. And so I fundamentally disagree with the concept of conscience votes for the people in this chamber, because we should be making decisions based on the idea that we are passing this reform to allow the conscience of the person who is terminally ill to make that choice. But here we are, and the reality is that on these reforms and on other reforms in this space, that conscience votes are the way that potentially we get these reforms through. And it's very clear and it's very good to see, on the other hand, for our democracy, members from all sides of this chamber expressing their views and having to engage directly with these issues themselves, rather than necessarily following a briefing paper that has been provided to them in a direction of how they need to vote. In the 4 years since the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill was last debated in the Upper House, when one single member unfortunately and disappointingly, tragically even thwarted its passage, all the other states have passed bills to legalise the right to die in peace and dignity. During this period in New South Wales, many thousands of people have died with great pain and distress when this shouldn't have been the case. I acknowledge the work of my Greens colleagues, Maureen Faruqi and Kate Thurman, who have done a lot of work advocating for this reform over many years. And I acknowledge the work of Alex Greenwich and Greg Piper, who are steering the way for this important reform now in 2021. They are just two of many co-sponsors to this bill, and as we have heard so far in this debate, of many supporters of this bill in this chamber. I would like to acknowledge the outstanding work done by community members, peak bodies and many in the community, as well as politicians, including my Greens state and federal colleagues, past and current, who have campaigned and advocated for this legislation long before it was on the top of everybody's agenda. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the work of Dying with Dignity, New South Wales, who have worked since 1983 to achieve what we hope will soon pass into law in New South Wales. I would also like to acknowledge Go Gentle Australia, who have advocated nationally since 2016, providing comprehensive resources and information on voluntary assisted dying. Additionally, I acknowledge the 29 Voluntary Assisted Dying Alliance member organisations, which include key national healthcare and professional bodies. I would also like to personally thank Christians Supporting Choice, the Council of the Ageing and the Doctors for Assisted Dying for writing to me directly to express their support for the bill. There is overwhelming support for this reform in the community. In the electorate of Newtown, over 80% of people supported voluntary assisted dying legislation. And I know how strongly people feel about this because I have been contacted by hundreds of locals in the electorate of Newtown who have shared their views on this bill, with the overwhelming majority of them being in support and sharing very personal individual stories of seeing their loved ones suffer, often horrifically in the last stages of their lives. I've been given permission to share a few of those stories on the record today to demonstrate why it is such a personal choice for people to make and why that choice needs to be able to sit with those who are terminally ill to be able to make, something that this bill would provide for. Julie from Newtown watched her brother suffer for 7 years of slow decline with cancer and a week-long agonising end-of-life scenario which she describes as inhumane, undignified and torturous. She wrote, "How awful to have a man so larger than life, wonderful, compassionate, loving, a father, a son, a brother, to be reduced to such horror, when at the end of his life he should have been able to had control over the way that he took his last breath." Val from Enmore writes, "My darling mother died in my arms a few weeks ago. She was 70. She had progressive supranuclear palsy, of which there is no treatment. She died in Stanmore of dehydration and starvation when she finally couldn't swallow any longer. For months, she was cramping and contracted and in great pain, curled up like a fetus. She faded away to a skeletal state, unable to see or move. Her eyes were yellow and pleading. She begged for a drink every hour of every day, but knew it was of no use. She had full capacity up until her last breath, when her blood trickled out of her mouth. For the last 2 weeks of immense suffering, I asked the nurse in charge and the GP to give her intravenous morphine at a dose incompatible with life. My mother nodded her wish every time I asked, but she was a believer in euthanasia. The professionals wanted to let her slip away, but it was against the law." Michael, a doctor from Surrey Hills, wrote to me, "I believe that a person should be able to die with dignity when facing a potentially painful, undignified death. I was at the bedside of both of my parents who died of cancer. I genuinely would have ended their suffering weeks earlier had such been allowed. Frankly, on a number of occasions, my father asked me to end it for him. My mother just kept saying, 'I want it to be over, just let me go to sleep and not wake up.' Of course, I was powerless to help either of them in their last wishes. The last months of their lives were an unending journey of waiting to die, interspersed with pain, unpleasant medical procedures, and sometimes less than inhumane treatment. Where terminal illness is concerned, an individual should have the right to select the time of his or their death. Given genetic probability, I too will face the similar future as my parents unless action is taken by individuals such as you. I urge you to support a person's right to choose." I cannot say more or add more to the powerful stories of these individuals that have shared their very personal tragedies with us and allowed me to put them on the record today. I couldn't say anything that makes it clearer about why we need this reform. We know that this legislation is long overdue and there must be more done. We know that there should be no more delays. It is time to allow people in New South Wales to be able to die with dignity. I'd like to address one comment made just while I was in the chamber just now in relation to comments made by the member for Mount Druitt, which I think were very unfortunate in the context of this debate. The member for Mount Druitt made the broad statement saying that Indigenous people don't support voluntary assisted dying. I don't know how any member in this place, or indeed any person, can make a statement that would somehow attempt to define what the entirety of the First Nations community in New South Wales do or don't support, or do or don't think about any piece of legislation, or in fact any view. I think it's really important when we are having these debates that we don't make broad statements that seek to put on the record as fact something that clearly is false. It is impossible for the member for Mount Druitt to know whether or not all First Nations people in New South Wales do or don't support voluntary assisted dying laws. I also want to address the concerns raised by the member for Mile Lakes, and I appreciate, and I think we could all witness the difficulty and the challenge of talking about personal stories and personal situations and acknowledge the fact that he's raised serious concerns about this bill. The delay any further of passing voluntary assisted dying laws will mean that many, many people will suffer. And I appreciate that it might mean that we have some really heavy lifting and work to do in this place to address and consider details and amendments to make sure that this bill satisfies as many people as we can and is as good as it can be, so that we can ensure that it works for the people of New South Wales. But we know that these things have been tried before, and we know the effort that it takes to get to a point where we are having a debate on a bill like this. And so I would urge those members who may think that this bill needs to be shifted or changed in some way to be able to get their support to work constructively with all of us so that we can find ways to strengthen it, because I worry that there will be not another time for us to do this, and in the gap between us being able to act, more and more people will suffer in pain as a result of them not being able to choose to die with dignity.
Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Newtown, and I call the member for Manly.